August 25th, 1944, somewhere east of Paris. The air, thick with the metallic scent of diesel exhaust and the fine dust of pulverized French roads, hangs heavy. A platoon of M4 Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of Patton's unstoppable Third Army, sits silent. Not a single 88mm shell hole mars their olive-drab paint. They are not pinned down by a Wehrmacht ambush or a hidden anti-tank gun. They are immobilized by an invisible enemy, a foe more relentless than the Waffen-SS, the humble fuel gauge. The crews, restless and exposed, check their watches, scan the empty fields, and curse the one thing headquarters could not provide. Their tanks, the 30-ton war machines that had chewed through the German 7th Army in the Falaise pocket, were now nothing more than 30 tons of useless steel, brought to a halt by an empty fuel can. This was the great paradox of the Normandy campaign. The Allies had achieved a breakout so total, so devastatingly successful, that it threatened to strangle their own armies long before the Wehrmacht could, creating an impossible supply crisis that could only be solved by an equally impossible feat of logistical willpower, a desperate, high-speed gamble known as the Red Ball Express. This crisis was not a failure of imagination, but a failure to imagine the sheer scale of success. The Allied armies were, quite literally, victims of their own stunning velocity. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, watched this logistical nightmare unfold with a mixture of pride and terror. In his memoirs, he wrote of the breakout that began on July 25th, Operation Cobra. For 7 weeks we had been stalled on the doorstep of France. Now, within a matter of days, we were cutting across the enemy's rear, enveloping his armies, and stabbing toward the heart of France. But this stab was bleeding fuel. Bradley's divisions were advancing at a rate that shattered every pre-invasion projection. The problem was what logisticians call the tyranny of distance. Every mile the combat divisions advanced was another mile a supply truck had to travel from the beaches. The front line was a voracious, insatiable beast, and the umbilical cord feeding it was stretching to the breaking point. The front was moving, but the supply depots were not. They were still clustered around the D-Day landing sites, hundreds of miles to the west. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, had planned for a different war. Their models, based on the brutal, static trench warfare of the First World War and the agonizingly slow advance in Italy, had projected a methodical, phased advance. Logistical planners, led by the meticulous and often criticized Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, head of the Communications Zone, comms, had prepared for a scenario where the Allies might still be fighting for control of the Cotentin Peninsula in September. They envisioned a neat, orderly build-up of supplies in massive depots behind a slowly advancing front. Instead, Patton was nearing the Meuse River, and his tanks were running on fumes. General Lee's initial reports from July paint a picture of a system already under strain, struggling just to support the beachhead. By late August, those reports were frantic. The system was not just strained, it was broken. The Allied war machine had the finest soldiers, the best equipment, and air supremacy, but it was being defeated by basic arithmetic. This was the statistical hammer that threatened to halt the entire invasion. An average US infantry division, when engaged in active combat, required approximately 700 to 750 tons of supplies per day. An armored division, with its thirst for fuel and ammunition, consumed even more. By the end of August, SHAEF had 28 divisions in contact with the enemy, chewing through a staggering 20,000 tons of materiel every single day. And the vast majority of this tonnage was not bullets or K rations. It was POL, petrol, oil, and lubricants. A single M4 Sherman tank had a fuel efficiency of roughly 0.6 miles per gallon. An armored division's organic transport could carry perhaps 1 day's worth of fuel. The advance from Saint-Lô to Paris was over 200 miles. The math simply did not work. The tonnage deserts, as they became known, were vast stretches of liberated France where the supply lines had evaporated. Trucks dispatched from depots near Omaha Beach would often burn 75% of their fuel just making the round trip to the front, delivering a meager 25% to the combat troops before turning around to repeat the cycle. Germany couldn't believe it. Their own intelligence, analyzing the shattered French rail network and the inadequate port facilities, concluded that the Allied advance must stop. It was logistically impossible for Eisenhower to sustain his armies. From the German perspective, the most powerful weapon in Field Marshal Model's arsenal was not a Tiger tank, but the simple fact of geography. It was the simple, undeniable fact that the Allies had outrun their tether. The victory of Cobra had created a strategic vacuum, and as Patton's armor plunged into it, that tether stretched, frayed, and finally snapped. The crisis was absolute. The advance would stop. The Germans would have time to regroup on the Siegfried Line, and the war would drag on into 1945. It was a foregone conclusion, unless the Allies could invent a river of steel and gasoline, a river that flowed 24 hours a day, against all logic. The fundamental truth of 20th century warfare is that beaches are for invasion, but ports are for conquest. The D-Day landings, for all their improvised, bloody heroism, were a temporary solution. The vast armada that supplied Omaha and Utah beaches was entirely dependent on weather, and the ingenious artificial Mulberry harbors were, as the great storm of June 19th proved, tragically vulnerable. That storm, a once-in-a-century gale, ripped the American Mulberry at Omaha to shreds, halting the flow of supplies for critical days. To sustain an army of millions, to fuel an advance across a continent, General Eisenhower needed a deep-water, all-weather port. Not just any port, but one of the great ports of Europe. In the calculus of the invasion, all logistics, all plans, and all projections pointed to a single, vital objective on the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, Cherbourg. It was the linchpin. Without it, the Allied armies would be chained to the coastline, and the entire invasion would wither and die, starved of the fuel and ammunition needed to break out. The battle to seize this gateway was not a simple maneuver. It was a brutal, grinding street fight. Major General J.N. Farry, Lawton Lightning Joe Collins, commanding the U.S. 7th Corps, was tasked with the assault after his divisions had cut the peninsula on June 18th. He pushed his men relentlessly north. But the German defense was not a token rearguard action. The port's commander, General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, possessed a garrison of nearly 40,000 men, a motley collection of naval personnel, fortress troops, and shattered infantry divisions. More importantly, he had been given a direct, unequivocal Führer order: fight to the last man and deny the port to the Allies. Von Schlieben turned Cherbourg's massive 19th-century granite forts and the subterranean naval arsenal into a fortress. Collins's troops, who had expected to be fighting in the hedgerows, found themselves in a nightmarish urban battle. Primary accounts from the 9th and 79th Infantry Divisions describe clearing heavy concrete bunkers with pole charges and flamethrowers, a bitter foretaste of the fortress battles that would come later at Aachen and Berlin. When von Schlieben finally surrendered himself and the remnants of his garrison on June 26th, the Allies felt a surge of collective relief. They had their port. That relief lasted only as long as it took for the first engineers to enter the harbour. What the Allies found was not a gateway, but a tomb. The Germans had executed one of the most thorough, systematic, and diabolical acts of logistical sabotage in modern warfare. This was not a panicked, last-minute destruction. It was a cold, calculated engineering plan, supervised by naval specialists. The man tasked with the monumental cleanup, U.S. Navy Captain William A. P.A. Sullivan, the chief of naval salvage, was staggered by what he found. His official reports read like a catalogue of industrial ruin. The Germans hadn't just blown up the massive dockside cranes. They had toppled them into the deep water basins, then used further explosives to shatter their structures underwater, creating a tangled, submerged web of steel spaghetti. They had scuttled over 36 ships, freighters, trawlers, and concrete-filled hulks in precise locations to obstruct the main shipping channels. But the true, cynical genius of their plan lay in the details. As Sullivan's divers and salvage teams began the perilous work of clearing the wreckage, they found that the Germans had embedded telemines and aerial bombs times inside times the concrete quay walls, set to detonate when salvage crews tried to lift sections. They had wrecked locomotives and dumped them into the harbour entrances. In one basin, they had even welded railroad irons to the tops of submerged wrecks, angled just below the waterline, designed to rip the hulls out of any salvage vessels that got close. Captain Sullivan, in his post-action assessment, stated the destruction was a masterful job, beyond a doubt the most complete, intensive, and best-planned demolition in history. The numbers tell the story of this catastrophic success. Schaeff's pre-invasion planners, in their optimistic projections, had calculated that Cherbourg would be partially operational by D+8 June 14th. They projected it would be handling 20,000 tons per day by D+4 1 around July 17th. This was the figure upon which the entire advance across France, especially the fuel-hungry Operation Cobra, was predicated. The reality was a logistical nightmare. Because of von Schlieben's fanatical defense and the engineered sabotage, the port was not declared operational in any meaningful way until the end of July. Even then, the tonnage was pathetic. By the end of the first week of August, Captain Sullivan's exhausted crews had cleared only a few berths. The port was handling a meagre 2,000 tons per day. By mid-August, nearly 2 months after its capture, it was still only processing 6,000 tons. This was a fraction of the required 20,000 tons needed daily for the 28 divisions that were now, thanks to Cobra, bursting out of Normandy and racing 200 miles away toward Paris. The capture of Cherbourg was a necessary strategic victory, but it was a profound logistical failure. It provided a trickle of supplies when the front lines demanded a biblical flood. This failure exposed the central flaw in the Allied plan, an over-reliance on a single point of entry that the enemy knew was the primary target. The Germans had lost the port, but they had won a crucial victory of time. They had successfully checkmated Eisenhower's logistics. With Cherbourg, a broken wreck, and the Mulberries battered, the communications zone under General Lee was left with an impossible problem. The armies were advancing, the ports were broken, and the only link to the front was a long, tenuous line of trucks stretching back to the beaches. This shattered gateway forced the Allies to look inward, to find a solution that did not rely on ports at all. They had to invent a new kind of supply line, one built not on ships and cranes, but on asphalt, gasoline, and raw human endurance. Late August 1944. At his forward headquarters, General George S. Patton, Jr. was a caged tiger. His Third Army, a coiled spring of armor and motorized infantry, had just performed one of the most astonishing advances in military history, a blitzkrieg in reverse that had shattered the German front, bypassed Paris, and was now poised at the banks of the Moselle River, with the German frontier itself, the Siegfried Line, in sight. But the engine of this great army was sputtering, starving for the one resource that mattered more than bullets, bombs, or bravado: gasoline. In his diary and later in his memoir, War as I Knew It, Patton's fury was volcanic. He raged against what he saw as the timid, bureaucratic strangulation imposed by Schaeff and the communications zone. He famously wrote, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks have got to have gas." He pleaded, he demanded, he threatened, convinced that with one final push, one final infusion of 400,000 gallons of gasoline, he could break the Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine, and end the war by Christmas. He was being held back, he believed, not by the Wehrmacht, but by his own supply sergeants. The crisis that brought Patton's legendary charge to a grinding halt was not, however, a conspiracy of timid logisticians. It was a problem of Patton's own creation, or more accurately, a problem created by his sheer, unprecedented success. The Third Army problem was unique. While the First Army under Hodges and the British and Canadians under Montgomery were engaged in more methodical set-piece battles, Patton's army was operating as a true 20th-century cavalry force. His armoured divisions, particularly the 4th and 6th, were not just advancing, they were exploiting. They were covering ground at a rate that defied all logistical planning, a spectacular 400-mile dash in less than 30 days. This kind of high-speed pursuit, with divisions fanned out across a wide front, burned fuel at a rate that no logistical system in history had ever been designed to support. Patton's philosophy was audacity, but he often forgot that the full phrase was audacity, and audacity, and audacity, asterisk, and adequate supplies, asterisk. He saw logistics as a servile function that must, by force of will, keep up with the demands of tactics. But in the summer of 1944, he was demanding that his logisticians bend the laws of physics. No one understood this impossible physics better than Patton's long-suffering G4, his chief logistician, Colonel Walter J. Mueller. While Patton played the role of the thunderous frontline commander, Mueller was the man in the rear, frantically trying to make the general's boasts a reality. Mueller was a master of improvisation, a logistician who had to perform daily miracles. His post-war analyses and reports, particularly logistics of the Third Army, paint a picture of a supply system held together by string and sheer desperation. As the Third Army raced east, Mueller's truck companies were driving 400-mile round trips from the beaches, a journey so long that the trucks themselves consumed most of the fuel they were carrying. To feed Patton's hungry tanks, Mueller resorted to extreme, ad hoc measures. He ordered Graves registration units, the men responsible for collecting the dead, to dump their grim cargo and use their trucks to haul gasoline. He systematically grounded entire squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolt reconnaissance aircraft, not because of enemy flak, but to siphon their high-octane aviation fuel and mix it, often improperly, with lower-grade gasoline for the Sherman tanks. His men created jerry-can brigades, vast, chaotic depots where thousands of 5-gallon cans were filled by hand from larger drums, a terribly inefficient and dangerous process that wasted precious fuel through spillage. Mueller was, in effect, trying to supply a blitzkrieg using methods that were barely sustainable for a static army. The statistical hammer that finally fell on Patton's ambitions in early September was brutal and unforgiving. The numbers, which Patton often dismissed as staff officer nonsense, were undeniable. At the absolute peak of its high-speed advance toward the Moselle, the Third Army, with its 4 corps and multiple armoured divisions, required a minimum of 500,000 gallons of gasoline per day just to maintain offensive operations. Some estimates, factoring in all of its motorized transport, pushed this figure closer to 800,000 gallons. During the last week of August, the actual daily deliveries of fuel reaching the Third Army's forward depots averaged a disastrous 30,000 to 50,000 gallons. Often, it was less. This was not a shortfall. It was an abyss. The army was receiving less than 10% of its minimum combat requirement. Patton's armour was not just low on fuel, it was bone dry. This was the moment the German High Command had been praying for. Patton's gambit, his belief that pure tactical audacity could triumph over the mundane realities of logistics, had finally failed. His spearheads, which had seemed unstoppable, sputtered to a halt at the Moselle River. The 4th Armoured Division, which had been on the verge of punching through a critical gap in the disorganized German defences, was now a static, vulnerable line of steel. This halt, forced by an empty fuel tank, was a strategic gift to the Wehrmacht. It gave Field Marshal Model just enough time to rush in reinforcements, to re-establish a coherent defensive front, and to man the concrete dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line. The war would not be over by Christmas. This single, high-profile failure, the silencing of America's most audacious army, was the final, deafening alarm bell. It proved to a reluctant Schaeff that improvisation was no longer enough. The entire Allied advance would collapse unless a solution, no matter how radical, was found. The crisis had reached its apex. and the only answer was a desperate plan that was already being quietly formulated in the back rooms of the communications zone. On August 25, 1944, a crisis meeting was convened at the headquarters of the communications zone, or COMZ. The atmosphere was grim. The maps lining the walls told a story of glorious victory, with Allied divisions plunging deep into France. But the logisticians in the room, the men responsible for feeding this advance, knew the truth. Those arrows on the map were about to stop. General John C.H. Lee, the exacting and often maligned commander of COMZ, faced his staff. The reports were unanimous. Cherbourg was a wreck, handling a fraction of the required tonnage. The French railway system, systematically vaporized first by the Allied air forces to times prevent times a German build-up, and now by the retreating Germans themselves, was non-existent. The armies, led by Patton's spectacular but fuel-guzzling Third Army, were stalled. The entire Allied endeavour, bought with so much blood on the beaches, was on the verge of collapsing from logistical starvation. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that a plan, so audacious it bordered on fantasy, was formally proposed. It was not a new port or a new railway. It was an idea to turn the roads of France into a non-stop 24-hour conveyor belt. The concept was code-named the Red Ball Express. The name itself was a piece of American ingenuity, borrowed from railroad slang. In the U.S. rail system, a red ball was a marker placed on a freight car, signifying that its contents were high priority and were not to be delayed or sidetracked for any reason. The plan was to apply this logic to the entire road network of northern France. It was a radical, brute force solution. The COMZ Motor Transport Brigade would designate two massive, one-way loops of highway, originating from the supply dumps near Cherbourg and the beaches, and running all the way to the forward supply depots near Chartres and Dreux. The northern route would carry supplies times to times the front. The southern route would be exclusively for trucks returning times from times the front. And to make this massive conveyor belt work, these highways, hundreds of miles of French national roads, were to be closed to all other traffic. Civilian vehicles were banned. Other military units were banned. These roads would belong exclusively to the Express, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with no exceptions. This impossible idea was brought to life by the logisticians on the ground, chief among them Colonel Laurent Red Ayres, the commander of the Motor Transport Brigade. Ayres was a transportation man to his core, and he understood that this plan could not work halfway. It required total, ruthless efficiency. The general order that established the Red Ball on August 25th was one of the most remarkable logistical documents of the war. As detailed in official COMZ reports and analysed by historians like Martin K.A. Morgan, the order was absolute. Ayres dispatched battalions of military police who were posted at every crossroads, every village junction, and every driveway along the 600-plus-mile route. Their orders were simple: keep the Red Ball moving. Any civilian car that strayed onto the road was to be pushed into a ditch. Any other military vehicle, regardless of rank or urgency, was to be flagged off and held. The Red Ball trucks had absolute priority. A mandatory speed limit of 25 miles per hour was established, a speed slow enough to minimize wear and tear but fast enough to maintain a constant flow. The trucks were to drive in convoy, maintaining a strict 60-yard interval, day and night, in all weather. The statistical hammer required to forge this plan into reality was staggering. The order on August 25th was not a request, it was a seizure. COMZ immediately requisitioned every available cargo truck it could find. The backbone of the fleet was the GMC CCKW, the legendary Deuce and a half, a 2.5-ton, 10-wheeled workhorse that would become the icon of the operation. Nearly 6,000 of these trucks were pulled from their existing units and assigned to the Red Ball. Provisional truck companies were formed overnight, often by stripping transport assets from divisions that had not yet been sent to the front. The two loops themselves were an engineering marvel. The main loop, Running from Saint-Lô to the depots supplying the 1st and 3rd Armies around Chartres was a round trip of over 600 miles. Drivers were issued strict orders. They were not to stop for anything short of catastrophic failure or enemy action. If a truck broke down, the driver was to pull it to the side of the road and wait for a dedicated wrecker crew. He was forbidden from trying to fix it himself. The flow was all that mattered. This was not just a supply run. It was a declaration of industrial war, a uniquely American solution. The Germans, with their fragmented and overextended logistics, could never have conceived of such a plan. The Allies, faced with the failure of their traditional supply lines, the ports and the railways did not retreat. They simply invented a new one. They substituted the internal combustion engine, mass-produced American steel, and limitless reserves of gasoline for the shattered infrastructure of France. It was a colossal gamble. It gambled that trucks could run 24/7 without breaking down. It gambled that roads could withstand the relentless pounding of thousands of heavy vehicles. And most of all, it gambled that the men forced to drive this unending 600-mile loop could endure the strain. The plan was audacious. The statistics were mind-boggling. But in the end, the Red Ball Express would depend entirely on the raw human endurance of the soldiers who gripped the steering wheels. The plan, as audacious as it was just ink on paper. It was a set of lines on a map and a staggering column of figures in a logistics ledger. The Red Ball Express was not a system of roads or trucks. It was a system of men. And this reveals the single greatest paradox of the Allied war effort in 1944. The United States Army that stormed the beaches of Normandy was a Jim Crow army, a force rigidly segregated by race. By doctrine, policy, and deeply ingrained prejudice, black soldiers were deemed unfit for the pressures of frontline combat. They were overwhelmingly relegated to service roles, stevedores at the ports, labourers in graves, registration units, or drivers in quartermaster companies. Yet, when the Allied advance faced its single greatest logistical crisis, when the entire war effort was grinding to a halt, the army did not turn to its elite white combat divisions to save it. It turned to the very men it had systematically disenfranchised. At the peak of the operation, nearly 75% of all drivers hauling the gasoline and ammunition on the Red Ball Express were African American. This policy was known as service, not combat. It was a reflection of a deeply racist society and a military high command that genuinely believed, despite all evidence from previous wars, that black men lacked the intelligence, courage, and discipline for high-intensity warfare. This systemic prejudice was a source of profound bitterness and frustration for the more than 1 million African Americans who served in the armed forces. They were fighting for a nation that denied them basic rights, waging a war against Nazi racial ideology while living under their own country's racial segregation. This tension was perfectly captured by the Double V campaign, championed by black newspapers like the Times Pittsburgh Courier *. The slogan called for victory at home, victory abroad, a dual war against fascism in Europe and racism in America. Men who had volunteered or been drafted, eager to prove their patriotism, found themselves issued shovels instead of rifles, assigned to dig ditches or unload cargo far from the fight. The Red Ball Express changed that, in a way. It was not combat, but it was the war's absolute center of gravity. The men who drove the trucks were pulled from these very quartermaster and transportation companies. They suddenly became the most critical component of the Allied machine. The primary evidence of their experience comes from the post-war oral histories of the drivers themselves, men who spoke with a mixture of immense pride and lingering bitterness. Private First Class James E. Evans, a driver with one of the quartermaster truck companies, recalled the sheer exhaustion. "You didn't have time to think," he stated in an interview decades later. "You just drove. You drove, you got loaded, you drove again. You tried to sleep a little bit when they was loading your truck." These men understood the irony of their position. They were the invisible men, suddenly made indispensable. They were trusted to haul the lifeblood of the army, facing enemy snipers and Luftwaffe strafers on the roads. But they were not trusted to carry a rifle in an infantry platoon. Their barracks were segregated, their mess halls were segregated, and they were often commanded by white officers who held them in open contempt. Yet, without them, Patton's tanks sat silent. The statistical hammer of the manpower mobilization for the Red Ball was as staggering as the tonnage it required. The plan needed thousands of qualified truck drivers times immediately asterisk. The army did not have them. So, COMSI raided every rear echelon unit it could find. Clerks were pulled from their typewriters, cooks from their field kitchens, and musicians from their regimental bands. Many of these men had barely driven a truck before, let alone the massive 2.5-ton Deuce and a half. They were given crash courses, sometimes lasting only a few hours, on how to handle the heavy, non-synchromesh transmissions, and then they were thrown onto the 600-mile, non-stop loop. In total, the Red Ball Express operation, at its height, comprised over 23,000 men. The vast majority, the core of this relentless machine, were black. They were organized into provisional companies, often working with half the maintenance crews they actually needed, and given a single, impossible order: keep the trucks rolling. These men were the unlikely saviors of the 1944 campaign, precisely because the Army's own racist doctrine had deemed them unfit for such a high-stakes, high-pressure role. They were not supposed to be the heroes, they were supposed to be the support. But in the logistical war, the support times was times the front line. Every single day, as they wrestled their heavy trucks over pulverized roads, fighting off crippling fatigue, they were proving that doctrine wrong. They were demonstrating a level of endurance and dedication that no one in the high command had believed possible. They were not just hauling gasoline. They were fueling the liberation of a continent and, in the process, staking a claim to their own equality that could no longer be ignored. The engine of the Red Ball Express was the Deuce and a half, but its heart was the segregated soldier who, despite everything, refused to fail. If the Red Ball Express had a non-human hero, it was, without question, the GMC CCKW-21, divided by 2-ton 6x6 truck. It was the red blood cell of this massive logistical artery, the steel embodiment of the entire operation. To the men who drove it, the truck was a living, breathing entity, defined by its sensory footprint. It had a specific, unmuffled roar from its 270 cubic inch L-head engine, a deep-chested growl that became the background noise of liberated France. It had the constant smell of gasoline, hot oil, and overworked metal. It had the bone-jarring vibration that came up through the steel floor and the thin seat cushion, a physical assault on the driver's kidneys and spine that lasted for hundreds of miles. Affectionately and universally known as the Deuce and a half, this truck was not a sophisticated piece of technology. It was a masterpiece of American mass production, a brute force solution to a brute force problem. The Deuce and a half was the physical product of the arsenal of democracy, the industrial concept that President Roosevelt had championed. It was born at the General Motors Victory Machine in Pontiac, Michigan. The sheer production numbers are the industrial hammer that explains the Red Ball Express's very possibility. While German industry struggled, under constant bombardment, to hand-build a few hundred complex and over-engineered Tiger tanks, the American industrial base was churning out these trucks with an almost geological force. Between 1941 and 1945, General Motors produced over 560,000 of this single truck model. It was a torrent of steel, rubber, and horsepower, a testament to an industrial philosophy that prized reliability and quantity over complexity. The genius of the Deuce and a half was not that it was the time's best times truck, but that it was the time's perfect times truck for this specific war. Simple, rugged, and available in almost unimaginable quantities. The perfection of its design was detailed in its wartime technical manuals, like TM 9-801, which became the Bible for the mechanics who had to keep them alive. Its primary feature, the one that made it indispensable on the continent, was its legendary 6x6 go-anywhere drivetrain. All 10 of its wheels, dual axles in the rear, could be powered, giving it the traction to haul tons of supplies, not just on the paved highways of the Red Ball route, but through the pulverized, muddy tracks that led to the frontline depots. The French road network had been shattered by Allied bombs and German demolitions, but the CCKW was designed to handle it. Its engine was a simple, rugged GMC 270 inline-six. It was not a high-performance engine, but it was a marvel of reliability, designed with interchangeable parts and a simplicity that allowed a 20-year-old mechanic working in a muddy field with basic tools to fix it. But its most important feature, from the perspective of the Red Ball logisticians, was its sheer toughness. The 2.5-ton designation was its Times official, Times off-road cargo rating. On the paved roads of the Express, drivers and loading crews quickly discovered it could handle far more. They routinely loaded them with 5, 6, or even 7 tons of supplies, more than double its official rating. The truck would groan, the leaf springs would flatten, but it would move. This relentless performance, however, created a new dual conflict for the operation, the battle against the machine's own mechanical limits. The Red Ball Express did not just use these trucks, it abused them in a way their designers had never intended. The plan required them to run 24/7 on a 600-mile loop with almost no time for preventative maintenance. The drivers, pushed by their officers and their own sense of duty, took matters into their own hands. It was common practice for drivers to remove the governor, a small device on the engine designed to limit its top speed to around 45 miles per hour. With the governor removed, a driver could push his deuce and a half to 55 or 60, shaving precious hours off the run. But this came at a terrible cost. The engines, not designed for these sustained high speeds, would overheat, blowing gaskets and throwing rods. Tires, the single most critical and scarce commodity, would shred under the combination of speed and overloading. Brakes, designed to stop 2.5 tons, would fade and fail when trying to stop 7 tons. The side of the Red Ball route was a continuous graveyard of these broken-down workhorses, their exhausted drivers waiting for a wrecker, a stark reminder that the operation was constantly at war with its own equipment. The deuce and a half was in the end far more than just a vehicle. It was the physical manifestation of America's industrial will, a mass-produced, rugged and expendable tool. It was the steel backbone of the supply line. It could be overloaded, abused, and run into the ground, but its sheer numbers meant that for every truck that failed, another was waiting at the depot to take its place. This endless, replaceable river of steel was something the German High Command, with its dwindling resources, simply could not comprehend. When this steel backbone was paired with the unbreakable human endurance of the drivers, the impossible river of supplies became a thundering, 2-4-hour-a-day reality, grinding its way toward the German frontier. The Red Ball Express was not a job. It was a state of perpetual, agonizing motion. For the drivers, the day was not 24 hours long. It was an unending 48-hour cycle, or longer, of noise, vibration, and exhaustion. The world shrank to the dimensions of the steel cab, which reeked of suffocating gasoline fumes, hot diesel exhaust, and the stale, unwashed sweat of the men who had sat in the seat before. There was no time to clean the cabs, no time to air them out. At the depots near Chartres, a driver would finish his 600-mile-plus odyssey, hand his manifests to a clerk, and stumble out of the cab. A replacement driver, who had just managed a few hours of fitful sleep on a cot or in a muddy tent, would immediately slide into the same seat, still warm from the previous man's body. This hot seat changeover was the norm. The engine was never shut off, the wheels never stopped turning, and the moment a driver gripped the wheel, he was subjected to the constant, mind-numbing vibration that came up from the floorboards, a low-frequency assault that worked its way into his bones, making sleep impossible and waking life a blurry, painful endurance test. The brutal reality of the loop was a logistical nightmare that defied all standard military procedure. The round trip, from the supply dumps at Saint-Lô to the forward depots and back, was often over 600 miles, and by September, as the armies pushed farther, it was stretching toward 800. The primary rule, hammered into every driver, was do not stop. The convoy was a river, and any truck that stopped for any reason other than enemy action or total mechanical failure was a dam, risking the entire flow. This meant all human needs were secondary. Drivers ate their cold K-rations biscuits, canned cheese, and soluble coffee with one hand on the wheel. There were no scheduled rest stops, no mess halls. Urination happened in empty cans or was held for agonizing hours until the truck was being loaded or unloaded. The system was designed to have 2 drivers per truck, a main driver and a co-driver. In theory, one would drive for 6 hours while the other slept. This was a catastrophic failure in practice. It was physically impossible to sleep in the passenger seat of a Deuce and a half that was bouncing over pulverized roads. The co-driver would be hunched over, his head bouncing off the steel door or the vibrating dashboard, getting no rest at all, simply waiting for his own 6-hour turn at the wheel in a state of advanced fatigue. Oral histories from veterans of units like the 4,135th Quartermaster Truck Company are filled with accounts of men driving for 36 or 48 hours straight, kept awake by nothing but terror, willpower, and Benzedrine tablets. This no-stop rule created a unique and desperate subculture centered on mechanical failure. The dual conflict for the drivers was not just against fatigue, it was against their own failing equipment and the rigid policies of the express. When a truck blew a tire or a gasket, the driver was under strict orders: pull to the absolute shoulder of the road, and times weight asterisk. He was forbidden to try and fix it himself, as this would create a bottleneck. He was to wait for one of the roving ordnance maintenance wrecker crews. But these crews were stretched impossibly thin. A driver could be stranded for 6, 10, or even 24 hours, completely alone, as his own convoy disappeared over the horizon and thousands of other trucks thundered past, covering him in dust. This led to a widespread and technically illegal practice: cannibalization. A driver whose fuel pump failed would, under cover of darkness, walk a mile back to another broken-down truck and steal its fuel pump. Tires were the worst. A driver with a shredded tire would jack up his truck, walk until he found an abandoned wrecker, and steal a tire, hoping he had the tools and the strength to change it himself before an MP patrol caught him. The ordnance crews themselves were the unsung heroes, working in muddy fields with minimal tools, swapping entire engines and transmissions in a matter of hours, their hands raw and their bodies soaked, just to get another truck back on the line. The 2 greatest non-human threats on the Red Ball route were dust and darkness. By day, the roads, which were often simple macadam or even limestone, were pulverized by the constant 24-hour pounding of thousands of overloaded trucks. The result was a permanent cloud of fine, white, choking dust that hung over the entire 600-mile loop. It was so thick that drivers could not see the truck 60 yards in front of them, as regulations dictated. They were forced to close the distance, driving nearly blind, navigating by the vague shadow of the vehicle ahead. This dust choked the drivers, coating their lungs and rawing their eyes, but it was even worse for the engines. It bypassed the Deuce and a half's primitive air filters, mixing with the oil to form a grinding paste that scored pistons and destroyed engines from the inside out. At night, the dust was replaced by a far greater terror: the blackout. To prevent giving the lingering Luftwaffe an easy target, all trucks were required to drive with cat's eye headlights. These were headlights covered by a metal plate with 2 tiny horizontal slits, which threw a dim beam of light perhaps 10 feet in front of the truck. Drivers were navigating 7-ton, overloaded vehicles at 25 miles per hour, in total darkness, able to see nothing but the 2 tiny red blackout taillights of the truck in front of them. To lose sight of those red dots was to be instantly lost, and to get too close was to guarantee a catastrophic rear-end collision. This relentless, non-stop grind was a form of self-imposed psychological and physical warfare. The Red Ball Express succeeded not because of a brilliant plan, but because its men were willing to endure a level of crippling, systemic fatigue that no army had ever before asked of its logistical troops. This assault on the human body, this 24 season of vibration, noise, dust, and darkness, was the true price of keeping Patton's tanks fueled. It was a brutal, ugly, and exhausting war, fought not against the Wehrmacht, but against the limits of human endurance. And as the drivers pushed deeper into France, they would soon discover that exhaustion was not the only enemy waiting for them on the road. There is a pervasive myth in warfare that the rear echelon is a place of safety, a zone of hot meals, warm billets, and bureaucratic paperwork, far removed from the sharp end of the conflict. The Red Ball Express, by its very definition, was a rear echelon operation. Its drivers were logisticians, not infantrymen, but this myth dissolved on the dusty 600-mile stretch of highway. This was not a safe zone. It was a long, thin, incredibly soft target, a river of flammable gasoline and high explosives, flowing 24 hours a day through a country that was not yet fully secured. The men who drove the express found themselves fighting a desperate three-front war. They faced the external, conventional enemy, the Wehrmacht. They faced the opportunistic, terror-based enemy, the Luftwaffe. And, most lethally of all, they faced the relentless, insidious internal enemy, their own crippling exhaustion. The first front was the most conventional, yet the most unpredictable. The Allied breakout at Falaise had been a spectacular victory, a pocket that had encircled and annihilated much of the German 7th Army. But it was not a clean, hermetic seal. In the chaos of the rout, thousands of disorganized but still heavily armed German stragglers had been bypassed by Patton's racing armored columns. These soldiers, cut off from their units and command, melted into the vast French countryside, hiding in the thick forests, abandoned farmhouses, and shell-torn villages that lined the Red Ball route. For them, the endless, thundering convoy was an unmissable, low-risk target. Official COMZ after-action reports are filled with notations of convoy ambushed by sniper fire or route temporarily closed to clear bypassed enemy pocket. A Red Ball driver, hunched over his wheel in a state of deep fatigue, would suddenly hear the sharp crack of a Mauser car 98K, followed by the sickening sound of a bullet punching through the thin steel of his cab door. These drivers were not combat troops. Their M1 rifles were often locked in a rack above the windshield, useless in a sudden ambush. They were logisticians, hauling cargo, and they were terrifyingly nakedly vulnerable. Teller mines, the Wehrmacht's potent anti-tank weapon, were another common threat, laid at night on the dark roads by these same straggling units, intended to rupture the convoy and create a catastrophic bottleneck. The second front was the enemy in the sky. By August 1944, Allied air supremacy was a statistical fact. The skies over Normandy were owned by the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Spitfire. But this supremacy was not absolute, and it was primarily a daytime phenomenon. At night, the Luftwaffe was still a potent, opportunistic terror force. The endless stream of Red Ball trucks, even with their pinprick cat's eye blackout lights, was a tempting target for any Ju-88 night fighter or lone Focke-Wulf 190 pilot on a hit-and-run strafing mission. The terror of these attacks is a common theme in the oral histories of the drivers. A veteran of a quartermaster truck company, James Evans, recalled the utter helplessness. There was no warning, just the sudden ripping sound of 20mm cannon fire. The primary targets were the gasoline tankers and the ammunition trucks. A single tracer round was enough. A truck loaded with 5,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline would not just explode, it would detonate, lighting up the whole sky, as one driver put it. This incandescent fireball would become a perfect, blazing beacon for the Luftwaffe pilot to circle back and rake the rest of the now halted, illuminated convoy. The drivers, trapped in their cabs, could do nothing but cut their engines, pray, and try to crawl into the ditch by the side of the road as the night was torn apart by secondary explosions. But by all accounts, the third enemy was the most lethal, the most relentless, and the one that claimed the most lives on the Red Ball Express. It was not a German bullet or a 20mm cannon shell. It was the irresistible biological pull of sleep, the physical and psychological toll of 48-hour, non-stop driving, of the constant vibration, the choking dust, and the mind-numbing focus of an 800-mile round trip was a form of torture. Drivers were pushed so far beyond the limits of human endurance that their bodies simply began to shut down, whether they wanted to or not. The greatest danger was the micro-sleep, the involuntary 1-second nod-off. At 40 miles an hour, a 1-second micro-sleep means the truck has travelled nearly 60 feet, completely blind. The results were catastrophic. Oral histories are filled with horrific common sights. Drivers would describe the wreckers, the ordnance recovery trucks, constantly at work, hauling Deuce and a halves out of deep ditches. The most frequent and ghastly scene was the rear-end collision, where one Deuce and a half had ploughed directly into the back of another. There were no enemy planes, no sniper fire. It was simply that the driver in the rear, after 40 hours at the wheel, had finally, fatally, fallen asleep, his foot still pressed to the accelerator. Many drivers described the terrifying experience of waking up in a field, having veered off the road and ploughed through a fence, the engine still running, with no memory of the last 30 seconds. This was the gauntlet. The Red Ball Express was its own unique, blurred, three-front war. It was a route where the driver had to be constantly vigilant for a sniper in a farmhouse window, a strafing plane in the night sky, and, most terrifyingly, the insidious, overwhelming betrayal of his own eyelids. The drivers were in a constant state of low-grade terror, a fear compounded and magnified by their profound, bone-deep exhaustion. They were fighting a war where the primary objective was not to kill the enemy, but simply to stay awake, stay on the road, and deliver the cargo, a battle for survival that was measured in gallons, miles, and agonizing minutes. The staggering statistics of the Red Ball Express, the 412,000 tons of supplies, the 6,000 trucks, the 82-day operational window are the skeleton of the story. They provide the scale, but they are lifeless. The true history, the primary evidence of what it cost to make this logistical miracle a reality, is not found in the tonnage reports. It is found in the human voice, in the letters written in pencil on damp paper from a muddy tent, in the post-war oral histories recorded decades later by men whose hands still remembered the vibration of the Deuce and a half steering wheel, and in the fiery editorials of the newspapers that followed these men to war. To understand the Red Ball, we must zoom in from the macro level of 20,000-ton deficits and focus on the micro level of a single, exhausted driver. The dominant theme in every single one of these accounts is the profound, bone-deep, and lethal exhaustion. The men who drove the express were in a constant battle with their own biology. In his oral history, Philip Dick, a soldier who volunteered for the Red Ball, gave a stark account of his training. He had never driven a truck in his life. He was pulled from his unit, given roughly 1 hour of instruction on the massive, unfamiliar vehicle, and told he was qualified to drive the 600-mile gauntlet. He was not an exception, he was the rule. This lack of experience, combined with the impossible schedule, was a deadly combination. One driver, in his post-war account, recalled his 2-week career on the Red Ball, a blur of non-stop motion. He described being asleep in the passenger seat while his buddy, who had exactly 1 day of driving experience, was at the wheel. He awoke in terror to the truck weaving violently back and forth down a steep grade, the inexperienced driver having lost control. Miraculously, they avoided a crash. Others were not so lucky. The route was lined with the smoking wrecks of drivers who had lost their 2-second fight with the micro-sleep. This was the reality of the grind, a life measured not in days, but in round trips. But this exhaustion was fused with a deep, undeniable, and complex pride. These were men who, just weeks before, had been relegated to digging ditches or loading ships, told by their own army's doctrine that they were unfit for high-stakes roles. Now, They were the most important men in the European theatre. Sergeant Levada Hall, one of the more than 20,000 drivers, spoke of this responsibility. They were no longer just service troops, they were the saviours of the front line. This pride was forged in the shared danger. One driver, in a first-person account, described his convoy being stopped by an officer. General Patton himself, the man whose army they were feeding, needed their specific load of gasoline on the other side of Paris. They were rerouted, driving directly toward the sound of the guns. Another driver recalled being on a truck that had a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a ring above the cab. When 3 German planes appeared, his convoy and 2 others stopped, and all 3 machine guns opened up, a torrent of tracers from supply trucks. Together, they brought one of the planes down. This was not a rear echelon job. This was war, and they were in the thick of it, proving their courage with every gallon of gas they delivered. This sense of pride was sharpened by the bitter, ever-present reality of the dual conflict. This was the second V in the Double V campaign, a movement championed by the leading African-American newspaper of the time, the Times Pittsburgh Courier *. In January 1942, a 26-year-old black defense worker from Kansas named James G. Thompson wrote a letter to the Times Courier-Times that would define the war for 1 million men. He asked, "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American?" He was tired of the hypocrisy of fighting for a freedom abroad that he was denied at home. He proposed a new rallying cry, the double VV for a double victory. The first V for victory over our enemies from without, the second V for victory over our enemies from within. The Times Courier-Times adopted this slogan, and it was embraced with fierce passion by black soldiers across the globe, especially by the men of the Red Ball Express. They knew, with a painful clarity, that they were the living embodiment of this paradox. They were trusted to fuel Patton's army, but they were not trusted to eat in the same mess hall as his white soldiers. They were dying from German snipers, Luftwaffe strafers, and catastrophic exhaustion, all while serving in a Jim Crow army. This intense, pressurized environment of pride, exhaustion, and injustice created its own unique, unofficial culture. To stay awake, the drivers sang. They shouted. They invented their own slang. To circumvent the 4-5 mile-per-hour governors on their engines, they stripped them, turning the non-stop supply run into what one veteran called a free-for-all at a stock car race, as they pushed their overloaded trucks to 60 miles per hour in the dark. The Double V slogan was not just an editorial, it was a lived reality. There were Double V baseball games played in the mud behind the depots, Double V clubs, and even, according to the Times Courier *, a Double V hairstyle. This was a culture of survival, a way of asserting their humanity in a system that sought to reduce them to a statistic, a driver, a truck number, a tonnage quota. The primary evidence, the letters from men like James G. Thompson, the oral histories of drivers like Philip Dick, the defiant reports of the Times Pittsburgh Courier-Times, is not just anecdotal colour. It is the data. It proves that the Red Ball Express was not a mechanical system. It was a human system. It was a machine built of flesh and blood, of men who were systematically abused by their own army, yet who refused to fail. The impossible supply crisis was solved by men who were themselves living an impossible paradox. Their triumph was not one of logistics, it was a triumph of human will. For the men gripping the wheel of a Deuce and a half, the war was a disorienting and exhausting blur, fought on 2 simultaneous and contradictory fronts. This was the dual conflict. The first front was the visible, external war, a desperate, high-speed race against the clock, against the anemic fuel gauges of Patton's tanks, against the constant threat of mechanical failure, and against the lingering, opportunistic German enemy. This was a war of logistics, measured in tons per mile. But the second front, for the 75% of drivers who were African American, was an invisible, internal, and soul-crushing war, a daily, humiliating battle against the systemic racism and ingrained prejudice of their own army. This second war, fought not with bullets but with policy, with segregated facilities, and with the casual contempt of their white counterparts, was often the harder and more bitter fight. The first conflict was a war against the impossible demands of their own high command. The communications zone, or ComZ, was run by logisticians, not combat commanders, and their war was fought on statistical charts. They were under unbearable pressure from SHAEF to meet the insatiable demands of the frontline armies. This pressure was funneled directly down to the Red Ball truck companies in the form of relentless, inhuman tonnage quotas. Reports from COMZ headquarters demanded that the Express move a minimum of 75,000 tons per week. To the officers on the ground, these were not just targets, they were absolute, non-negotiable orders. This command-level pressure forced company-grade officers to drive their men past every conceivable limit of human endurance. It was this pressure that led to the hot seat policy, to the 48-hour shifts, and to the widespread, tacit approval of removing engine governors. An NCO who reported too many mechanical breakdowns or too many drivers collapsing from fatigue was not seen as a responsible leader. He was seen as an obstacle to the quota. The drivers were, in this sense, an expendable resource in a war of statistics. Their bodies were the fuel that comms was burning to keep the tonnage charts in the black. This external pressure, however, was at least a recognizable part of war. The second conflict was a uniquely American poison, a friendly fire of bigotry that was more baffling and more demoralizing. This was the double V in practice, and the primary evidence is staggering in its hypocrisy. The most infamous and well-documented example was the policy of the Red Cross clubs. In cities like Paris, the American Red Cross operated clubs and canteens meant to be a home away from home for soldiers on leave. A black Red Bull driver, stumbling out of his cab after a 48-hour non-stop run from Cherbourg, covered in grease and dust, dreaming of a hot meal and a cup of coffee, would arrive at a Red Cross club, only to be met by a sign, "Whites only." He would be turned away, told to find the segregated and invariably smaller and less equipped coloured facility. The ultimate, soul-crushing irony, reported by correspondents for the Times Pittsburgh Courier-Times and confirmed in dozens of post-war oral histories, was that this same driver, standing on the sidewalk, would then watch as German prisoners of war, the very enemy he was risking his life to defeat, were escorted times inside, times the whites-only club, and served hot food. The Army's logic was that the Geneva Convention mandated humane treatment for prisoners, but its own Jim Crow policies mandated segregation for its own soldiers. This was not an isolated incident. It was the system. White military police, who were supposed to be manning the intersections to keep the vital Red Bull convoys moving, were frequently cited in reports for times stopping the convoys to conduct spot-pass checks on black drivers. They would pull over a truck loaded with critical 105mm artillery shells, a truck that was desperately needed at the front, simply to harass the black driver, demanding to see his papers in an endless, petty game of racial dominance. Meanwhile, white drivers in the same convoy would be waved through. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were the vital artery of the Allied armies, but they were being treated like a second-class, criminal element by the very army they were saving. This brings us to the ultimate statistical hammer, the final, undeniable hypocrisy of the entire operation. The United States Army of 1,944 operated on a doctrine that, on paper, classified African American soldiers as unfit for the high-stress, high-stakes environment of combat. They were, according to the official War Department studies of the time, less intelligent, lacked initiative, and were prone to panic. They were, therefore, to be used only as a labour source. Yet, in the fall of 1,944, with the entire Allied advance stalled, this same army was now 100% reliant on this unfit, inferior force for its entire time's operational ability. Nearly 75% of the Red Bull drivers were black. The superior white combat soldier in Patton's Third Army, the man deemed racially and mentally fit to fight, could only pull the trigger on his M1 rifle because the inferior black service soldier in the rear was willing to die from exhaustion, sniper fire, and Luftwaffe Strafing runs to bring him the bullet. The Red Ball Express was a living, 600-mile long, 4-hour-a-day refutation of the Army's own racist doctrine. This dual war forged a unique legacy, a complex mixture of profound resilience and deep, lasting bitterness. The men of the Red Ball Express did not just solve an impossible supply crisis. They did it while simultaneously enduring a level of systemic, official racism that would have broken a lesser force. They proved, on the roads of France, day after agonizing day, that the Army's entire justification for segregation was a self-serving and demonstrable lie. They were not just hauling cargo, they were carrying the moral and logistical weight of the entire Allied invasion on their shoulders. The Allied victory in France was not just a war of tactics and courage, it was a war of tabulation. It was a brutal conflict fought on spreadsheets, on loading manifests, and on the daily reports of the communications zone. The German High Command, analysing the shattered French ports and the vaporized rail lines, concluded that the Allied advance must stop. Their logic was sound, based on their own logistical capabilities. What they could not, and did not, factor into their equations was the Red Ball Express. They couldn't believe it because they could not comprehend the sheer brute force weight of the numbers. The true, undeniable proof of the operation's impossible success is not found in a single heroic anecdote, but in the cold, hard, overwhelming statistical hammer of American industrial output, a force that simply rewrote the laws of warfare. The first statistic that buries all doubt is the peak day. The Red Ball Express was a system designed to surge, to meet the fluctuating, insatiable demands of the front. On a single 24-hour day, September 12, 1944, the men and trucks of the Express achieved their apex. According to the U.S. Army's official logistical history, Logistical Support of the Armies, Volume A. On that one day, the Red Ball Express moved 12,342 tons of supplies from the depots to the forward armies. This is a number so large it becomes abstract. So, what is 12,342 tons? An average U.S. infantry division required 700 tons per day. This means that in a single 24-hour period, the Red Ball delivered enough material, gasoline, ammunition, rations, and medical supplies to fully sustain over 17 combat divisions. It was a flood of supplies. It was millions of gallons of gasoline, millions of rounds of .30 caliber ammunition, and tens of thousands of artillery shells, all delivered by hand, by truck, over a 600-mile loop, in one rotation of the clock. This was not a supply line, it was a daily, targeted avalanche. If the peak day was the avalanche, the total haul was the glacier. The Red Ball Express ran for 82 consecutive days, from August 25th until its official termination on November 16th, 1944. By this time, the port of Antwerp had been captured and opened, and the railways were finally being repaired, creating a new, more efficient supply artery. In that 82-day window, the final COMZ reports state that the Express delivered a total, mind-boggling weight of 412,193 tons. Again, the number is too vast to comprehend. To put it in perspective, a modern Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, one of the largest warships ever built, weighs approximately 100,000 tons. The men of the Red Ball Express, in less than 3 months, hauled the equivalent weight of 4 of these supercarriers. They hauled it in 5-ton increments, on the backs of overloaded Deuce and a half trucks, over pulverized roads, 24 hours a day. This was the sheer, undeniable weight of the arsenal of democracy in motion. But this statistical hammer cuts both ways. The cost of this achievement, measured in the same cold, hard numbers, was staggering. This was a dual conflict in the spreadsheets as well. The first cost was the fuel to run the Express. The Deuce and a half was a rugged truck, but it was not efficient. It got roughly 4 miles to the gallon, and that was when it wasn't overloaded. The Red Ball trucks were running 600 to 800 mile round trips. The math was horrifying. Logisticians quickly calculated that for every gallon of gasoline delivered to Patton's tanks at the front, the Red Bull truck itself was burning a gallon on the journey. It was a 1-to-1 ratio, a logistical nightmare of inefficiency, but it was the only option. The operation consumed millions of gallons of its own cargo just to exist. The second cost was tires. The constant speed, overloading, and shattered roads shredded tires at a rate that shocked the high command. Tires became a more precious commodity than gasoline. At one point, the entire operation was threatened not by a lack of fuel, but by a lack of replacement rubber. And finally, there was the cost in steel. The Red Bull Express did not just use its fleet of 6,000 trucks, it consumed them. These machines were run without maintenance, abused, and overloaded until they were literally driven into the ground. By November, the vast majority of the Red Bull fleet was a wreck, a graveyard of shattered axles, blown engines, and warped frames. It was a fleet of vehicles permanently expended, sacrificed on the altar of the 82-day push. The human cost was just as high. The casualty rate from accidents from drivers falling asleep at the wheel or brakes failing on a dark road was far higher than the combat casualty rates in many frontline divisions. This was the final, statistical blow. This was what the German High Command, in their operations rooms, could not understand. They were waging a war that was, in many ways, still chained to the 19th century. In 1944, the Wehrmacht still employed over 1 million horses for its logistics, primarily on the Eastern Front. Their supply lines were based on muscle, railroads, and horse-drawn carts. The Allies, faced with the same problem of broken railways, simply conjured an 800-mile, 24-hour river of internal combustion engines. They threw 6,000 trucks and 23,000 men at the problem and accepted the catastrophic cost in fuel and materiel as the price of victory. This was not warfare as the Germans understood it. It was an industrial avalanche on wheels, a brute force solution that cared nothing for efficiency, only for results. The numbers were the proof, and the German generals, with their dwindling fuel and horse-drawn wagons, could only watch in disbelief. In late August 1944, inside the operations rooms of Oberbefehlshaber West, the German High Command in the West, a profound and terrifying mystery was unfolding. Field Marshal Walter Model, Hitler's fireman, a man renowned for his defensive genius, was staring at a strategic impossibility. According to every calculation, every map, and every tenet of German logistical doctrine, the Allied armies, particularly Patton's Third Army, should have already ground to a halt. The German Wehrmacht, in their own retreat, had executed a brilliant denial of infrastructure campaign. They had blown the railways, demolished the ports, and mined the crossroads. They knew, with absolute certainty, that the Allies had outrun their supply lines. Yet, the reports from the front told a different story. Patton's armor was still moving. The American infantry divisions were still fully engaged. An endless 24-hour river of steel, gasoline, and ammunition was somehow flowing across France, and the German High Command simply could not understand how. This logistical disbelief was at the very core of the German military mindset. The German concept of warfare, the Blitzkrieg, was a masterpiece of tactical audacity, but its logistical tale was, by 1944, archaic. The Wehrmacht's own logistical doctrine was overwhelmingly reliant on railroads. When the rails were cut, their capacity to supply a high-speed advance was crippled. Even more damning, as detailed in their own internal reports, the German army was still, in large part, a 19th-century force. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht employed over 1 million horses to draw its supply wagons and artillery. Their motorized truck fleet was a chaotic, cannibalized mix of captured Czech, French, and Russian vehicles, a nightmare of non-interchangeable parts and constant mechanical failure. The German High Command, projecting their own times, logistical limitations onto the enemy, had made a fatal calculation. They assumed that without railways, the Allies would be forced to pause for weeks, if not months, to rebuild the ports and railheads. This would give Model the priceless time he needed to establish a new, hardened defensive line on the west wall. What the German generals were witnessing was not a traditional supply line, but a times Materialschlacht, times a battle of pure, unadulterated material, an American speciality. Post-war interrogations and memoirs are filled with the astonished testimony of high-ranking German commanders. They were, as one general put it, fighting a poor man's war against a rich man. They were astounded and astonished at what they perceived to be the unlimited cornucopia backing up the Americans. This cornucopia was the Red Ball Express, where the Germans saw an unsolvable problem, no railways. The Americans saw a simple equation. They substituted the internal combustion engine for the locomotive. They threw 6,000 trucks, 23,000 men, and limitless quantities of gasoline at the problem, creating a 600-mile, 24-hour conveyor belt out of thin air. This was a concept so alien to the resource-starved German mindset, so wasteful and brutish in its execution, that it was dismissed as an impossibility until it was thundering past their routed divisions. The most potent primary evidence of this disbelief comes, ironically, from the Allied commander himself. In his memoir, *Crusade in Europe*, General Dwight D. Eisenhower recounted a conversation he had with captured German generals times after times the war. He was explaining the logistical arrangements that had enabled the Great Sweep across France. As he described the systems of truckage, the air supply, and the Red Ball Express, the German generals were stunned. According to Eisenhower, they suggested that of all the spectacular feats of the war, even including their own, the Allied success in the supply of the pursuit across France would go down in history as the most astonishing. This was not flattery. It was a confession of profound strategic shock. They were admitting that the Allies had won not just by tactics, but by wielding a logistical hammer that broke the known rules of war. The strategic consequence of this impossible river of steel was devastating. The German plan in the fall of -1944 was predicated on one thing, that the Allied advance would culminate, run out of fuel, and stop. This would allow the Wehrmacht to regroup, rearm, and man the Siegfried Line for a long, bloody winter campaign. The Red Ball Express was the X-factor that shattered this plan. It ensured that the Allied spearheads' times did not culminate. It fed Patton's tanks just enough fuel to keep probing, to keep finding the gaps, and to keep the German 7th Army from ever setting a defensive line. The German armies, which their own commanders admitted were shattered after the Falaise pocket, were never given a moment to breathe. They were hounded across France by an army that, by all logic, should have been static and starving. In the end, the Red Ball Express was more than just a supply line. It was a psychological weapon. It was the physical proof that Germany was not just fighting the armies of Eisenhower and Montgomery. It was fighting the factories of Detroit, the oil fields of Texas, and the sheer, inexhaustible industrial will of a continent that could, by force of will, conjure a 600-mile highway system into existence. To the German High Command, which could no longer fuel its own panzer divisions for a single day of combat, this endless, thundering river of American trucks was not just a logistical miracle. It was the sound of their own inevitable defeat. By late October 1944, the Red Ball Express was a dying machine. It was a victim of its own impossible, relentless success. The highways of the Express were becoming a continuous, 600-mile graveyard of broken-down trucks. The Deuce and a halves, which had been run 24 hours a day for nearly 3 months without proper maintenance, were being consumed by the very operation they enabled. Tires were shredding faster than they could be replaced. Engines, pushed past their limits by overloaded cargo and removed governors, were blowing gaskets and throwing rods. The fleet was collapsing. More importantly, the human cost was becoming unsustainable. The drivers, men who had been at the wheel for 80 days straight, were at the absolute limit of physical and psychological endurance. The Red Ball had been a brilliant, desperate gamble, but its cost in fuel, tires, steel, and human exhaustion was becoming a logistical black hole. The system was failing, and it was failing at the worst possible time, just as the Allied armies, now stalled and bleeding at the concrete dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line, needed more supplies, not fewer, for the final, bloody push into Germany. The Allied High Command knew the Red Ball was a temporary, inefficient bridge. They had their eyes fixed on a single, massive, strategic white whale, the one objective that could, in a single stroke, solve the entire logistical crisis, the port of Antwerp. Antwerp was, without exaggeration, the single greatest logistical prize in Europe. It was one of the largest and most sophisticated deep-water ports in the world, but it had one feature that made it seem like a miracle. It was almost completely intact. The docks, the massive cranes, the railheads, and the vast warehouses had been captured on September 4th by the British 11th Armoured Division, which had advanced so rapidly that the German garrison was taken by complete surprise. The local Belgian resistance, in a heroic and critical action, had risen up to prevent the German demolition teams from setting off their charges. The Allies now held a pristine 20,000-ton per day capacity port. The only problem? It was over 50 miles inland, and it was completely, totally useless. The port of Antwerp was a prize locked in a steel box. The Germans, while having lost the city itself, still held the 50-mile-long, heavily fortified Scheldt estuary that connected the port to the North Sea. No Allied supply ship could enter the river without sailing through a gauntlet of massive German coastal artillery batteries, minefields, and entrenched infantry dug into the flooded, nightmarish landscape. Chef, in its euphoria after the race across France, had made a catastrophic error. It had prioritized Montgomery's airborne gamble at Market Garden over the mundane task of clearing the Scheldt. This decision led to one of the most brutal, overlooked, and costly battles of the entire war, a fight given to the 1st Canadian Army. The Battle of the Scheldt, which raged from October 2nd to November 8th, was a battle in a bathtub, as Canadian soldiers called it. The Germans had blown the dikes, flooding the low-lying polder country. The Canadians were forced to conduct amphibious warfare in a landscape of mud, minefields, and canals, against fanatical German paratroopers and fortress troops. Primary evidence from the diaries of Canadian soldiers, such as those from the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, describe fighting for weeks in chest-deep, freezing water, assaulting German bunkers that could only be reached by small boats, all under a constant, hellish barrage of artillery and mortar fire. It was a bloody, grinding, and deeply unglamorous battle that cost the Canadians over 6,300 casualties, but they and their attached British, Polish, and Dutch units finally, painstakingly, cleared the estuary. The floodgate opened on November 28th, 1944. On that day, the first Allied cargo ship, a Canadian-built freighter named the Times James B. Weaver *, steamed into the port of Antwerp, its holds filled with supplies. Its arrival signalled the death knell of the Red Ball Express. The brutal, unforgiving statistics tell the story. The Red Ball Express, on its single times, peak times day, had managed to move a staggering 12,342 tons. The port of Antwerp, in its first few days of operation, was Times already, Times handling 25,000 tons per day. Within weeks, this was ramped up to 40,000 tons. The sheer volume of material that could be offloaded at Antwerp's intact docks, loaded directly onto the repaired rail lines, and sent to the front just 60 miles away, made the 800-mile, fuel-guzzling, truck-shredding Red Ball completely obsolete. The High Command had officially terminated the operation on November 16th, in anticipation of Antwerp's opening. The Red Ball Express was never intended to be a permanent solution. It was an 82-day, desperate, magnificent bridge. It was a brute force, inefficient, and profoundly American solution to an impossible problem. It had been born of the crisis at Cherbourg and the breakout at Cobra, and it had successfully spanned the logistical chasm from Normandy to the German frontier. It had fed Patton's tanks, supplied Hodges's infantry, and kept the entire Allied advance alive when, by all the laws of warfare, it should have stalled and died. With the Times James B. Weaver Times tied up at an Antwerp quay, that bridge was no longer needed. The impossible conveyor belt, having done its job, was finally and gratefully shut down. We return to the image of late August 1944. A platoon of M4 Sherman tanks, the steel spearhead of the Allied advance, sits silent and useless on a dusty French road, their engines cold, their fuel tanks empty. They are defeated not by a Tiger tank, but by a logistical calculation. Now, picture the winter of 1944. Those same tanks, fueled, armed, and relentless, are grinding their way through the concrete dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line, pushing into the German fatherland. The unseen legacy of the Red Ball Express is the direct, causal link between these two moments. It is the story of how an 82-day, desperate, and inefficient gamble, born of crisis, did not just save a campaign, but permanently reshaped the very doctrine of modern warfare and the social fabric of the army that waged it. The most immediate legacy was logistical. The Red Ball Express, in its brute force execution, rewrote the manual on military supply. Before 1944, the railroad was the undisputed king of logistics. Armies advanced only as fast as their engineers could lay or repair track. The Red Ball Express was the first time in history that a massive, motorized truck, fleet times replaced, times the railway as the primary, long-haul supply artery for a high-speed offensive. It proved that a river of steel on wheels was a viable, if costly, alternative. This was a paradigm shift. The US Army, and later NATO, internalized this lesson. The entire logistical doctrine of the Cold War was built on the Red Ball's legacy, a belief in massive, forward-deployed stockpiles, a reliance on heavy-duty truck transport, the descendants of the Deuce and a half, and the brute force industrial willingness to accept inefficiency and massive fuel consumption as the price of operational tempo. The German High Command, still reliant on over 1 million horses, had been beaten by an army that simply conjured a 600-mile highway system into existence. The Red Ball proved that in modern warfare, logistics was no longer the servant of tactics. It was a co-equal and perhaps dominant partner. But the more profound legacy, the one that truly paid off the dual conflict fought by its drivers, was social. The Red Ball Express was a crucible that burned away a foundational lie of the United States Army. For its entire history, the Army had operated on a racist, segregated doctrine that deemed African American soldiers as inherently unfit for high-stakes, high-pressure roles. They were, according to the official line, a labor source, not a fighting force. The Red Ball Express, by placing units that were nearly 75% African American into the single most critical, high-pressure, and indispensable role of the entire European campaign, turned this doctrine into a demonstrable 412,000-ton absurdity. These men, whom the army had deemed inferior, were the very soldiers saving the superior white combat divisions from logistical starvation. They endured sniper fire, Luftwaffe strafing, and a level of crippling exhaustion that broke men, and they did not fail. Their performance was a powerful, undeniable argument for desegregation. It was primary evidence, written in blood, sweat, and diesel exhaust. This evidence was not ignored. In 1948, when President Harry S. Truman faced the monumental decision of integrating the armed forces, he did so against the advice of many of his top generals. His decision was bolstered by post-war analyses, like the Gillam Board report, which had been forced to acknowledge the stellar, dedicated performance of segregated units like the Red Ball drivers. The Double V campaign, which had seemed like a bitter irony, had achieved its second victory. Executive Order 9981, which officially desegregated the United States Armed Forces, was a direct, traceable legacy of the men who drove the Express. This is the final connection to the thesis. The impossible supply crisis, born of a victory so total it threatened to strangle itself, was solved by an equally impossible feat of willpower. The legacy is therefore twofold. It was a triumph of times, industrial times, will, a flexing of the arsenal of democracy that could throw 6,000 trucks at a problem, run them into the ground, and accept the catastrophic cost as the price of continued momentum. Germany couldn't believe it because they simply did not possess the industrial capacity to even conceive of such a plan. But more importantly, it was a triumph of times, human times, will. It was won by 23,000 men, a majority of whom were forced to fight a dual war against German snipers and the Jim Crow policies of their own army. They were denied hot food at Red Cross clubs while German prisoners were fed. They were harassed by their own military police. And yet, they got in their cabs, they fought off the micro-sleep, and they delivered the goods, day after agonizing day. The Red Ball Express was shut down on November 16th, 1944, a magnificent, battered, and exhausted machine that had done its job. It was a temporary, 82-day bridge that spanned the logistical chasm from the beaches of Normandy to the borders of the Third Reich. But its legacy was permanent. It did not just save the 1944 campaign and enable the final destruction of the Nazi regime. It forced the US military to confront its own internal demons, proving on the dusty, dangerous roads of France that courage, endurance, and patriotism have no colour. It was an operation born of desperation that not only changed how wars are supplied, but also helped, in a profound and lasting way, to change the nation that supplied it.